May 17, 1967. Deep under the Arctic tundra of the Kola Peninsula, a concrete bunker housed the nerve center of the Soviet Union's 10th Independent Air Defense Army, a cold, humming cathedral of Soviet power. Colonel Ivan Morozov watched the sweeping green trace on his radar scope, the steady pulse that felt like the heartbeat of the motherland's shield. The air was heavy with ozone from hot vacuum tubes and the stale cigarette smoke of men who spent 12 hours a day staring into an electronic void. On the huge plotting board covering the far wall, operators slid wooden blocks representing fighter squadrons and missile batteries. It was a fortress built of steel and mathematics, the crowning achievement of the Protivovozdushnaya Oborona, the PVO. They were the guardians of the northern frontier, defending the shortest route American bombers would take to reach Moscow. Their doctrine was absolute. Nothing gets through. Nothing ever had. They had proved it when they brought down the Americans' high-flying U-2 spy plane years earlier, a triumph still celebrated and taught in every academy. Their integrated network of radars, surface-to-air missiles, and the world's fastest interceptors was, in their eyes, an impenetrable barrier stretching up to the edge of space. On this cold Wednesday morning, that illusion was about to shatter. A junior lieutenant's voice, tight with confusion, crackled over the internal communications line. "Comrade Colonel, we have a contact, Sector 4, bearing 090. Morozov leaned forward, his chair creaking in the sudden hush. On the main display, a single, impossibly small dot had appeared over the empty sea, moving at a speed that had to be a malfunction. "Check your calibration, Lieutenant," Morozov said, calm and fatherly. "The machine is playing tricks." But the dot kept moving, not with the deliberate crawl of a bomber or the urgent yet predictable sprint of a reconnaissance aircraft. This was something else entirely. Its velocity matched that of a ballistic missile, yet it flew level, within the atmosphere. The numbers flashing on the plotting board were absurd, a cascade of impossibilities the system's designers had never imagined. Mach 3. Altitude 80,000 feet. The room, once filled with low, confident chatter, went completely still. Faces lit by the eerie green glow of their screens, the men stared at data their supposedly infallible equipment insisted was real. They had no idea what they were seeing. This is exactly the kind of story we uncover every week here at Cold War Impact. Subscribe now so you don't miss the real history behind the secrets. To grasp the shock that rippled through that Arctic bunker, you first have to understand how the Soviet High Command viewed the world. Their mindset had been forged in the furnace of the Second World War, a conflict that taught them a brutal lesson. A surprise attack from the air could spell the death of a nation. They had lost 27 million people, a demographic wound so deep it would scar them for generations. From the ruins of Stalingrad and Kursk came a vow, never again. That promise became the cornerstone of their military doctrine. The entire Soviet state was reshaped into a continental fortress, and its outer wall was the PVO. It was more than a service branch. It was a source of enormous national pride, a showcase of Soviet science and engineering. Propaganda posters from gray Leningrad apartment blocks to sun-soaked Crimean naval bases showed heroic missile crews and stone-faced pilots standing guard against the dark silhouette of American air power. The message was constant and unmistakable. The skies over the Soviet Union were sacred, inviolable, and shielded by the most advanced technology on the planet. Their confidence was not entirely misplaced. The numbers backed it up. By the mid-1960s, the PVO commanded thousands of interceptor aircraft. The MiG-21 was a nimble, lethal dogfighter. The Sukhoi Su-15 Flagon was a brute, a large twin-engine interceptor built for one purpose: to rocket to supersonic altitudes and destroy high-flying American bombers with long-range air-to-air missiles. On the ground, a chain of early warning radar sites stretching from the Baltic coastline to the remote wilderness of Kamchatka formed a tripwire capable of detecting an attack thousands of kilometers away. And then there were the missiles. The S-75 Dvina, known to NATO as SA-2 Guideline, was the system that famously blasted Francis Gary Powers' U-2 spy plane out of the sky at 70,000 feet in 1960. That shot was a massive psychological victory for the Kremlin. It proved to the world, and even more importantly to themselves, that American technological arrogance had limits. It demonstrated that the Soviet Union could now reach up and strike at the highest edges of the atmosphere. The ability to conduct aerial reconnaissance without risk of interception was a cornerstone of U.S. strategy. Without it, they were blind. They had no reliable way to count Soviet ICBMs, locate nuclear bomber bases, or track the expansion of submarine pens. In the paranoid, high-stakes chess game of the Cold War, that kind of blindness was potentially fatal. President Eisenhower demanded an answer: a new aircraft that would restore America's eyes in the sky. The contract went to the one organization famous for turning the impossible into reality: Lockheed's Advanced Development Projects Division, better known as the Skunk Works. Under the legendary and famously hard-driving leadership of Chief Engineer Clarence Kelly Johnson, a small group of America's best aeronautical engineers began tackling a problem that bordered on science fiction. The directive they received was breathtaking in its simplicity and audacity.
The directive was as bold as it was simple: create a manned aircraft capable of flying higher and faster than any missile or interceptor the Soviets could ever field. It couldn't merely surpass the U-2, it needed to leap beyond it entirely, entering a performance realm so extreme that it would be, for practical purposes, untouchable. This effort became Project Archangel, the program that eventually produced the A-12 and its better-known Air Force variant, the SR-71 Blackbird. The obstacles were immense. At the planned speed, over 2,200 miles per hour, more than Mach 3, the air friction alone would heat the aircraft's skin to temperatures that would turn normal aluminum into molten metal. The Skunk Works engineers had to master a new material that was notoriously difficult to shape and weld: titanium. The United States didn't have enough of it, so the CIA quietly established fake companies across the globe to acquire the metal from the world's biggest supplier, the Soviet Union itself. In one of the Cold War's greatest ironies, the Soviets unknowingly provided the raw material used to build the aircraft that would make their own air defenses obsolete. The engines required a revolutionary hybrid design, operating as conventional afterburning turbojets at low speeds, then gradually transitioning into ramjet-like behavior at high altitude. Pratt & Whitney's J-58 engines produced so much heat that the fuel, JP7, a special blend with an unusually high ignition point, had to serve as coolant for the airframe before being burned. The pilots needed suits closer to what astronauts wore: pressurized, temperature-controlled, and designed to keep them alive at heights where the sky turned a dark indigo and the Earth's curve was unmistakable. Every component, from the landing gear supports to the quartz cockpit windows, had to be created entirely anew. This aircraft wasn't just a plane, it was a near-space vehicle that happened to launch from a runway. And it was built around a single, quiet objective: to create a machine so technologically superior that the enemy would be left stunned, psychologically crushed as they watched it pass effortlessly through their most secure airspace. It was engineered specifically to produce disbelief. Back in the frozen bunker on the Kola Peninsula, Colonel Morozov's calm certainty evaporated like vapor in a jet plume. The mysterious radar contact was no glitch. Multiple independent stations were now tracking it, from coastal early warning radars to the precision systems tied to the S-75 missile batteries, each reporting the same impossible data. The intruder was now deep inside Soviet territory, crossing the shoreline without triggering a single challenge. It was a blade plunging straight into the heart of their supposedly inviolate airspace. Morozov seized the direct line to the airbase commander. "Victor, scramble everything. I want 2 flights of Sukhois airborne in 5 minutes. Vector 090, Angels 80+. The hesitation on the other end was immediate. 80+, Comrade Colonel? 80,000 feet, confirm? The altitude was so far beyond the ceiling of their best interceptors that the commander assumed it had to be an error. That is the data, Victor. Get your pilots airborne. Morozov slammed the handset down. On the plotting board, operators frantically tried to calculate firing solutions for the missile batteries, but the system was failing. The computers, programmed to intercept familiar targets like B-52s or F-4 Phantoms, couldn't keep up. The aircraft was too fast. By the time a solution was computed, the intruder was already dozens of kilometers past the intercept point. It was the equivalent of trying to hit a bullet with another bullet, except the target was 3 times faster. In the cockpits of the Su-15 interceptors, clawing their way into the thin, frigid air, pilots felt a mix of adrenaline and disbelief. Their orders were to reach maximum altitude and attack a target whose speed and height sounded like something from a science fiction story. With engines straining, the heavy fighters trembled as they climbed past 50,000 feet, then 60,000 feet. Through their masks, the pilots gasped for air as the sky darkened toward the edge of space. Their own radars showed nothing. The intruder was miles above their scan volume. Ground control kept sending updates, but the target moved so fast that the pursuit was hopeless. They were like hounds chasing a phantom, hearing the echoes of its passing but never catching a glimpse of it. One young pilot, squinting through the glare, finally saw something, a brief silver flash. A glint of sunlight bouncing off a shape so high above that it seemed to exist in a different world entirely. Below him, he could see the Earth curve. Above him, he saw the future, and it was leaving both him and his aircraft far behind. None of them knew that the American pilot, peering through his periscope-style window, could see their contrails trailing far below, 2 thin white lines against the blue and white marble of the planet. He could see everything, the naval bases, the submarine pens, the airfields, all of it captured in perfect detail by the cameras humming in the belly of his aircraft. In the PVO command bunker, the emotional shock wasn't panic. It was something deeper, a slow, crushing collapse of professional certainty.
It wasn't simply an intrusion, it was an insult, an act of staggering audacity. For years, the Soviet air defense system had trained to repel massive raids of American bombers, to counter nuclear-armed cruise missiles, and to fight through layers of electronic warfare. But this was nothing like the scenarios they had prepared for. This was disdain. The lone aircraft, untouchable and unchallenged, was not launching an attack. It was delivering a message. It was a declaration that their entire defensive fortress, the system they had devoted their careers to, the pride of their nation, no longer mattered. As the minutes passed and the tiny green trace continued its smooth, effortless path across their map, the atmosphere inside the bunker shifted from outrage to a deep, creeping sense of dread. Moments earlier, the operators had been confident masters of the airspace. Now they were powerless spectators. Their missile batteries sat idle. Their best interceptor pilots were struggling far below the intruder, unable to even see it. The mysterious dot passed directly over Severomorsk, the heavily protected headquarters of the Northern Fleet, one of the most sensitive military sites in the Soviet Union. It captured images of every warship, every dock, every command center. The Soviets were not only being surveilled, they were being mocked. In the most humiliating way imaginable, they were being shown that the Americans could penetrate their airspace at any moment, in any location, with complete impunity, and the Soviets could not stop it. Then, without warning,
The dot vanished from the radar screens. After slicing across the Kola Peninsula, the unknown aircraft banked south, flying a course that pointed straight toward Moscow. Panic erupted. Was this the opening move of a nuclear strike? A decapitation attack? Air defenses from the Arctic to the capital snapped to maximum readiness. Missiles were armed. Fighters scrambled from bases near Leningrad and Moscow. Half of the Soviet Union's Western air defense network braced for a blow that never arrived. Instead of continuing toward the capital, the aircraft executed a sweeping turn over Finland and slipped back across the Norwegian Sea, its speed never dropping below Mach 3. It had been inside Soviet airspace for less than 25 minutes. In that brief time, it had frozen the defenses of a superpower, photographed its most sensitive military sites, and exposed the enormous technological gulf between East and West. When it was over, a heavy, stunned silence filled Colonel Morozov's command center. The frenetic activity had vanished, replaced with a suffocating sense of failure. The officers stared at their screens, then at one another, faces drained of color. The giant map on the wall, once a symbol of their control, now seemed like a monument to their helplessness. They had unleashed everything available, their finest pilots, their most advanced missiles, their most experienced controllers, and failed even to get close. They hadn't so much as threatened the intruder. It was as though some divine being had descended from the sky, surveyed their defenses with casual indifference, and then departed, leaving behind a devastating new understanding. Their shield, their supposedly impenetrable barrier, had been exposed as comforting fiction. A phantom had passed through it with ease, planting the seed of a technological paranoia that would soon spread deep within the Soviet military system. The worldview of officers like Ivan Morozov, a worldview built on the unshakable belief in Soviet strength in invulnerability, had cracked at its core. They had once scoffed at the idea of an aircraft that no missile could reach until they confronted the Blackbird. What they felt now was horror and an uncomfortable realization that the Americans were playing an entirely different game, governed by rules the Soviets didn't yet understand. The terrifying display over the Kola Peninsula was not an isolated event. It was the opening salvo of a new, systematic form of psychological and intelligence warfare. What the shocked PVO officers did not yet grasp was that this was not a trial run or a one-off provocation. It was the operational debut of an entirely new system, a tireless, all-seeing eye that would observe them whenever it chose. The shock that rippled through that Arctic bunker soon became routine humiliation for air defense commanders across the vast Soviet frontier. The SR-71 Blackbird, operating from bases in California, the United Kingdom, and Okinawa, began flying regular missions that mapped every inch of the Soviet Union's military infrastructure. The program, codenamed Senior Crown, transformed the Blackbird from a mysterious intruder into a constant, terrifying symbol of American technological supremacy. The helplessness Morozov felt became a recurring experience for his counterparts from the Baltic to the Pacific. They were forced to watch, again and again, as the untouchable American aircraft carved its blazing supersonic paths across their most guarded regions. Each time, the Soviet reaction was the same, and each time, it was hopeless. MiG-21s launched with full knowledge they had no chance of reaching the Blackbird's altitude. The newer MiG-25s, Foxbats, designed specifically to counter the SR-71, would roar upward in steep, fuel-hungry climbs, occasionally reaching 70,000 feet. Their pilots fired missiles on near-ballistic trajectories, hoping luck might compensate for physics. But it never did. The American crews, nicknamed Habu, after a venomous Okinawan snake, would watch the missile contrails curl harmlessly below them, falling short by miles. Then they would arc over Finland and return home, their camera bays loaded with invaluable intelligence. Soviet pilots landed exhausted and demoralized, their cutting-edge interceptors defeated yet again. None of them were told that the Blackbird was not only higher but also faster than anything they could fly.
The regional PVO commanders in the Far East, having learned painful lessons from their counterparts in the West, knew exactly what awaited them. They could see the intruder approaching on their radar screens, a tiny high-speed blip that signaled yet another episode of oncoming humiliation. They would launch fighters and ready their missile batteries, but it was a ritual, not a defense. Everyone involved understood it was futile. The psychological strain was enormous. Imagine standing guard over a secret military complex only to look up and see the enemy calmly observing you from an unreachable height, photographing your position at will. It bred a corrosive sense of hopelessness that seeped through every rank, from the most senior general to the lowest radar technician. The Americans weren't merely collecting intelligence. They were demonstrating week after week that the Soviet air defense system, into which the state had poured billions of rubles and immense national pride, was fundamentally impotent. They proved with quiet regularity that the emperor had no clothes. What drove this reality home wasn't just the aircraft itself, which almost no Soviet ever saw with their own eyes, but its distinct and unsettling sonic footprint. The SR-71 did not produce an ordinary sonic boom. At such extreme altitude and speed, its shock wave expanded into something vast and rolling. On the ground, it came not as a sharp crack, but as a series of deep, resonant thuds that rippled across the landscape for miles. Windows trembled in their frames. The earth itself seemed to shiver. For the soldiers, sailors, and surveillance crews stationed at secret installations, this sound became an audible omen, an unmistakable sign of their own irrelevance. It was the voice of American power. It was the soundtrack of their defenses being effortlessly bypassed. It was a continuous reminder that their most advanced weapons were obsolete, their training meaningless, and their fortress nothing more than exposed terrain. The low thunder rolling down from the stratosphere became more than a physical sensation. It symbolized ideology cracking under the weight of reality. It was the sound of a system collapsing, not from bombs, but from technology so advanced it bordered on the miraculous. The shock of that first encounter in 1967 slowly hardened into grim resignation. The ghost in the sky was no longer an anomaly. It had become a constant fixture, an undeniable sign that the Americans were living in a future the Soviets could not reach. These repeated intrusions could not be buried in internal PVO reports forever. The rumbling booms from the upper atmosphere were soon accompanied by equally unsettling rumblings inside the Kremlin. The intelligence summaries that reached the polished desks of the Politburo and the KGB leadership at Lubyanka were deeply alarming. These were men who measured power in hard, unforgiving terms, and they understood exactly what the Blackbird represented. It was not merely a spy plane. It was a direct challenge to the legitimacy of the Soviet state. A government that promised technological supremacy and air defense dominance was being exposed, again and again, as unable to protect its own skies. The reconnaissance photos, clear black and white images of their nuclear bases, hidden submarine pens, and secret missile sites, were irrefutable evidence of a catastrophic intelligence breach. But the implications were even worse. The Americans could now track troop movements, identify new weapons deployments, and verify or refute Soviet ICBM numbers. In the fragile balance of mutually assured destruction, this gave Washington a staggering advantage. The Soviet nuclear shield, the core of their strategic power, was being compromised. Official acknowledgement of this reality, delivered in tense whispers behind closed doors, was bleak. The Soviet Union was technologically outclassed on a scale unseen since the early days of America's atomic supremacy. The response was frantic. The entire military-industrial apparatus was thrown into overdrive. The top directive was blunt and absolute: find a way to shoot down the American spy plane, no matter the cost. From this order emerged one of the most formidable yet fundamentally flawed interceptors ever built, the Mikoyan-Gurevich MiG-25, known in the West as the Foxbat. Outwardly, it was a monster. Constructed not from titanium, which the Soviets could not weld or mass-produce reliably, but from heavy nickel-steel alloy. Twin Tumansky R-15 engines, originally intended for a high-altitude cruise missile, gave the giant fighter unbelievable thrust. On paper, it looked ideal. In short bursts, it could exceed Mach 3 and climb above 70,000 feet. The Soviet Union poured vast resources into producing it, stationing Foxbats with elite PVO regiments across the nation. It was designed for one purpose: destroy the Blackbird. In reality, it was a disaster. Its flaws perfectly reflected the wider technological divide between the superpowers. Although the MiG-25 could momentarily reach the SR-71's speed, it could not maintain it. Running the engines near maximum thrust for more than a few minutes overheated them to the point of destruction. The American J-58 engines, in contrast, were engineered to operate most efficiently at Mach 3.2 and could do so for hours. The Foxbat's big brute force radar was designed to overpower jamming, but it struggled to track the SR-71's small radar cross-section at extreme distance. Its massive R-40 missiles were powerful, but unable to maneuver effectively in the thin upper atmosphere, and their guidance was easily disrupted by the SR-71's advanced electronic countermeasures. The result was that Soviet pilots were effectively sent on hopeless missions. Directed towards predicted intercept points, they would slam their engines to the limit in gut-wrenching climbs, fire missiles blindly towards a target they could neither see nor lock onto, and hope for a miracle. None ever came. Across the SR-71's entire operational life, over 1,000 missiles were fired at it. Not a single one made contact. The MiG-25, the highly publicized Soviet answer to the Blackbird, ended up as an expensive, noisy, and ultimately futile gesture. The emotional impact of this endless cycle of failure was crushing. The despair reached far beyond the cockpit. Engineers at the Mikoyan Design Bureau knew their creation could not catch what it was built to kill. Missile technicians watched their systems fail again and again. Radar operators were forced to report with growing embarrassment that the target had once more slipped away untouched. To the average Soviet serviceman, the belief that their nation matched the West technologically was evaporating. Propaganda could say whatever it wished, but the men who lived these encounters understood the truth.
They heard it first, not with their ears, but through the low, distant growl that drifted down from the upper atmosphere. That rumbling signature created a deep, corrosive cynicism inside the Soviet armed forces. If they were powerless to stop a single unarmed reconnaissance aircraft, how could they possibly expect to prevail in an actual war against the technological might of the United States? The Blackbird became far more than a surveillance platform. It turned into a symbol of the Soviet system's structural failings. It was a constant, high-altitude reminder that, despite their sacrifices and despite endless proclamations of socialist superiority, they were slipping behind. The terror and shock of the initial encounters gradually hardened into a slow, gnawing despair. It marked the psychological unthreading of an empire that had begun to grasp that it had already lost the race towards the future. The story of the SR-71 Blackbird is not merely the tale of a remarkable aircraft. It is a distilled version of the Cold War itself, a flawless illustration of the fundamental contrasts that defined the two superpowers. The sleek titanium apparition that haunted Soviet skies embodied a system that thrived on innovation, rewarded daring ideas, and drew on an industrial base so vast and agile that it could invent the future whenever necessary. Skunk Works was not the product of a 5-year plan imposed by a committee. It was the result of a culture where extraordinary minds were given the tools, autonomy, and encouragement to chase the impossible. The Blackbird was the physical expression of American industrial capability, an orchestra of exotic metals, revolutionary propulsion concepts, and cutting-edge computing, something the centralized, slow-moving, and chronically inefficient Soviet model could never hope to equal. Every rivet in its titanium frame,
every microchip guiding its navigation systems was a verdict on the ideological and economic contest that lay at the heart of the Cold War. The Soviet counterpoint was the MiG-25. It was a machine conceived in fear and built through brute force, a reactionary platform made of conventional materials pushed to their absolute limits. It represented the essence of the Soviet system, reliance on sheer size, heavy-handed engineering, and a desperate effort to mirror American technology without understanding the innovative culture that had produced it. They could construct something larger, heavier, or more powerful, but never something better. They were trapped inside a paradigm of imitation, perpetually one step behind, forever reacting to American breakthroughs. The inability of the MiG-25 to ever threaten the SR-71 was more than a tactical failure. It was a structural one. It was the sound of a command economy colliding with the relentless forward push of free market innovation. The Blackbird proved that true superpower status was not measured by the number of tanks, nor by the yield of nuclear warheads, but by the ability to imagine and execute a vision so far ahead that the opponent was not simply outmatched, but left in stunned confusion. The ultimate proof of that victory did not come from another silent pass at 85,000 feet, but from a loud, chaotic, jubilant scene on the ground. On the night of November 9, 1989, a former PVO officer stood near the Berlin Gate in Berlin, watching ordinary people armed with hammers and chisels do what the entire Warsaw Pact had never managed: break apart the Iron Curtain. He had devoted his life to an ideology that promised strength and historical inevitability. He had read the classified PVO after-action reports, the humiliating, powerless accounts of the invulnerable American black jet. In his mind, the fall of the wall and those reports were tied together. The technological defeat in the skies had been a secret prelude to the public collapse unfolding before him. A state that couldn't stop one spy aircraft from flying over its heartland turned out to be a state that couldn't care for its citizens, couldn't earn their loyalty, and ultimately couldn't even keep them confined behind a concrete barrier. The relentless pressure from the SR-71, the constant demonstration of undeniable technological inferiority, had helped erode the confidence of the Soviet leadership. It added yet another crack to an already failing foundation. As he watched the wall crumble, he understood that the Cold War hadn't been decided by armies clashing on open battlefields. It had been won in the labs of California, in the engine shops of Connecticut, and in the silent, dark blue heights 85,000 feet above Earth. In the epilogue of this ideological struggle, the contrast could not have been sharper. The Soviet Union built its worldview on a rigid doctrine, an insistence that scientific socialism would produce a perfect society, a future guaranteed by historical law. They erected a fortress of steel and concrete to shelter that fragile dream. But the American reality they encountered wasn't something their ideology could explain. It felt almost supernatural, a level of technological mastery so profound that it defied the calculations of their materialist worldview. To the men in the PVO bunkers, the Blackbird wasn't merely an aircraft. It was a chilling omen, a spectral visitor from a future that would never belong to them. It revealed that the true engine of history was not found in the writings of Marx, but in the boundless energy of human freedom and creativity. The Soviet Empire, despite its formidable facade, was always brittle and hollow. It could project an image of power, but it could not withstand the quiet, persistent truth delivered from the edge of space. The future belonged to someone else.